My name is David Sandoval. I was a petty officer 3rd class in the United States Navy, serving as a corpsman during World War II. I was 23 when the Japanese dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor. I was on the USCGC Taney, the only ship to survive the attack. December 7th, 1941, marks the day that will forever change my life, and set in stone events that will forever haunt me till I die. Let's start from the beginning. I awoke on the Taney as usual in the early morning hours with the sound of my best friend Roland across from me snoring, along with the slight rocking of the ship. It was time for me to report to nurse duty along with Roland. I was used to waking up early in the morning, since back home, my dad would wake me up to help him work on the ranch. God, how I hated those days. But it helped me with my military duties, I guess. I shook him awake to let him know it was time. A slight jolt and a mumble came out of his mouth, and he sluggishly got up and got ready to report for our station. Roland was this 24-year-old, 6-foot black guy who was bald with a stubble of a mustache. He was well built, and we didn't like each other at first since we had different ways of doing things during training exercises as a team. Plus, he thought I was white. See, back in those days, the military was segregated. Even though President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 to eliminate racial discrimination, I was still treated like crap in the White Soldier Battalion because I was Hispanic. When you signed up for the military in those times, there were only 2 races, white or Negro. That was it, and I got marked down as white. But it got to the point I was fed up with their bullshit and asked to transfer to a colored battalion, and they accepted. There in the colored battalion, they welcomed me into open arms, except there were some who were skeptical. That included Roland. Even though they knew my race, they didn't believe me, since, in their words, white-skinned Mexicans aren't a thing. And Roland was the main one who talked a lot of shit, especially about me. I grew up with Mexican parents who believed in hard work, but were equally as racist. Seeing how they were, I never understood racism and why it was a thing when I was young. I grew up with the mentality of treating people with respect, regardless of what you believe in or what you look like. But it gets hard to respect people when people look down on you and go to places of other races, and even in your own race, just to get the eye and get badly mouthed because my skin came out a different color than expected. It got to the point that the arguing and the shit-talking from Roland almost every day made me snap. So, while Roland was usually bad-mouthing me in the chow hall, I walked up to him and threw a straight left square in his nose. He was taken aback a bit, but we got into it soon after. Let me tell you, he has a mean left hook. But after that fight, coming out with a black eye and Roland with a fractured nose, we respected one another, shook hands and got along soon after. That is, once I found out what he was interested in, which was medicine. He had a deep desire to help people, same as me. The desire to help people came when this family had to move into a colored section housing. It was really in poor condition. Since white people didn't want colored people nearby or in their neighborhoods, people there at times were getting sick and they couldn't afford to see a doctor due to the piss poor paying jobs and shit working conditions of some of those factory plants. And even if you had money, most of the time the doctors didn't want to see them because of their race. So he tended to the sick the best he could. He got better with time, but knowledge limited him to basic treatment. That's when he made the decision to join the military for 2 reasons. 1, to fight for his people's rights, to show he can be on equal footing as white soldiers, and to garner knowledge to become a great medic, and so he can serve as a doctor to his community. At the time he wanted to join the US military, they were losing a lot of soldiers in combat. So they decided to let black volunteers join, and so he did, much to his wife's dismay. But ultimately she understood what he was doing could help everybody, not just his family. At first they wanted him in a warehouse doing intensive manual labor, and he refused, said he wanted to be a combat medic. But the recruiter told him he wasn't allowed to be in combat. So he offered him a position as a corpsman, which is basically a medic but doesn't deal with combat situations. Usually, anyways. He agreed and started his basic training. A month in, and that's when I transferred, and then the fight happened soon after. We bonded and became closer during our medical training, testing each other and even shot the shit during our free time. He told me about his wife and kid and how much he loved them. I envied how he talked about his family. Something I wish I could say about mine. When we finished training and started our jobs as corpsmen, me and him would stay long hours in the sick bay, tending to the sick sailors and marines till everybody was taken care of. And even then, our higher-ups had to bar us from working too much, as they thought it would hinder our performance in the long run. Since then, it was a routine of taking care of business and repeat. I had his back, and my hope is so did he. But, anyways, back to the day of the attack. I was heading towards the sick bay with 2 cups of coffee in hand, and handed one to Roland, who was working on paperwork. He said his thanks, and I asked him what was on the agenda. It was just supposed to be, again, your normal day of doing normal, tedious paperwork and tending to people when needed. But oh, how wrong I was to think that day would be our usual day. That's when I heard the fucking sound of a plane nosediving. I stopped what I was doing and began wondering in my head if it was just an Air Force exercise. And before I even had a chance to ask Roland, that's when the explosion happened. And soon after, a barrage of explosions happened all at once, rumbling the ship, knocking me down to the floor and Roland holding onto the desk. An alarm sounded off and a voice came on the intercom.
"We are under attack! I repeat, we are under attack! Please report to the nearest muster point immediately!"
Me and Roland looked at each other with a look of surprise and shock, but immediately snapped out of it, got up and we ran towards a muster point to make sure everybody was accounted for. We saw an officer and Roland demanded what was going on. He said from what he was told it looked like Japanese were suicide bombing into our ships, a tactic called a kamikaze. Everybody else around the ship started to show up to the muster point with a look of horror and confusion on their faces. And some guy covered in ash and blood ran towards the officer to whisper something in his ear. That's when the officer with a distraught face spoke up. He began giving out orders to do a search and rescue mission here at the port. With a yell from our officer to move out, we all ran towards the flight deck and opened the metal door. The blinding early morning sun hit my eyes hard for a second. And what I saw I thought I would only see in cinemas. Ships were on fire with smoke and ash in the distance. You could hear the distant cries for help with people running around on the ships and below it. Bits and pieces of the ship completely gone as it started to sink. A man yelled from below to get into the long bed half truck. We hurried over to him and jumped in. The man driving was a medical officer, Don Flickhanger. At the time, I wasn't focused on who he was, just the chaos around me. But that man is the reason where I am today. But I digress. My heart was racing, my adrenaline was pumping. I couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like a dream to me looking back on it. That's when I got a hard smack on my back. It was Roland. He looked at me and I stared back with a glazed look, beginning to snap out of it, and gave him a nod, focusing on the task at hand. I looked up to see the burning ship slowly sinking to the dark abyss that is the ocean. The more closer we got, the more I heard the crackling of flames and people screaming, crying. It was unbearable. I wanted to just clasp my ears shut and run away, but I had a job to do. I don't want those long nights of work and study to be for nothing. People need me right now, more than ever.